Hello and welcome back to UbiPsych. Before I get started again on this topic regarding Ben Shapiro and transgenderism, I want to give a little context. I don't have a political stake in this question. I like to view all sides of things, learn new information, and where I find something confusing or out of the ordinary, I like to investigate it further. I came across Ben's video that I criticized by watching him generally as a fan, although I don't agree with everything, and I enjoy watching him dismantle a lot of arguments. And he's obviously sort of a right or far right person, and I'm not offended by that. I don't agree or disagree. I don't care about politics, but it is important to understand that I, before and after that, was watching other videos that were very different. I, will watch a video by a right winger on, Michelle Obama is a transsexual or transvestite. And their evidence for that, not particularly compelling, though not devoid of evidence. If you watch, there's something there. And then I may watch a video by sort of an SJW snowflake or one of those popular YouTube channels where they do promote you can be any gender you want. And I find those a bit ridiculous in many cases, although I'm fine with allowing people to do whatever they want. It is sort of an endless quest to find your specific identification, and it can become, as Ben says, overwhelmingly complicated to where there's not 50 genders but infinite genders or one per person. And then maybe I'll watch a vlog by a trans person as they go through hormone treatment. This is my way of understanding an issue, to see everything I can about it. Those saying you can be any gender you want, those saying that there's no biological basis for transgenderism, those living that experience and looking at them to see, does this seem like mental illness? Does this seem like they're happy or unhappy with changes if maybe they're getting surgery? And those are interesting videos to me. That's where I come from on this. I was watching Ben's video and I found one thing where I thought he didn't fully stay consistent in the way he approaches things. And that's where this video came from. I have found new information, and it's really important to show Ben Shapiro is aware of this research. I found a video where he talks about it. So in my video, you may have seen that I talked about biological evidence for transgenderism. He presumably wasn't aware of it, I thought, because he said there was no evidence. In fact, he is aware of it. He just thinks it's weak evidence, and continues to explain that his belief, despite this evidence, is that the evidence is weak, or that there is a different explanation, or even if it's strong, that it's not particularly important. I'll let him speak for himself here momentarily. So it's as if he responded to my last video, although he clearly didn't, because he unlikely was someone to see it, as well as this was recorded about at the same time or earlier than my video. So I became aware of it, and at this point I want to show what he has said and continue the discussion from there. So I have to take back my claim that he hasn't seen it and that someone needs to bring it to his attention. Clearly someone has. He has responded to it, and we will see that here. The clip starts with some other information for context. I don't want to be accused of taking things out of context, yet I don't want to make you watch the entire video that he was in. So we'll let him sort of roll into it, because he says some other really important things as well. The video here is linked in the description, as well as I framed it so you can see the YouTuber who's provided it. Let's play the video and then we'll discuss.
Because this is silly, okay? The fact is this. If you're going to separate gender from sex, and you're just going to say that what gender is however you feel in your head, then there aren't two genders, right? There's no transgenders. There's not two genders. There's not 50 genders, as Facebook would have you believe. There are infinite numbers of genders, right? Because I am Ben-gendered, right? In my head, my gender is exactly what I say it is. And in your head, you have the number of genders that you say you have. The fact is that if you want to make gender so specific that it's just what's going on in your mind, then why box it into a various series of categories? Why not instead just say that you are, Bob-gendered or military or...
Here he makes a really good point that I happen to agree with. If you say it's just social construct, then it comes with the ramification that you can have as many of them as you like. This isn't necessarily a bad thing, to have many categories. It helps to understand people, but you would have to say it's not particularly legitimate. It is just something you've made up, and there could be, in fact, infinite, one per person. So, you have issues where if sex is just the same as gender, then there's nothing to talk about, because we don't need a different term, and we should just stop talking about it altogether. If it's just a social construct or something inside your mind, then yes, it would be essentially infinite. And you could choose to view that as fun or annoying, but it would be true that that you could have as many as you want. Agree with this point entirely.
Gendered, right? You have your own gender. The problem is once you separate off biology and gender, then you end up in this la-la land where basically we just say, okay, fine, we'll treat you as individuals with regard to your quote-unquote gender, but your sex is still the governing body. And that's the problem the left can't deal with. So instead what they try to do is they try to create this tenuous linkage between sex.
So far we agree on what this is about. I'm saying there is a biological link. He's saying it's tenuous, and he's about to explain his position.
Gender, even though gender is basically a made-up term. Sex is sex. End of story. You know, they've tried to basically say that you can have a female brain in a male body. There's no evidence of that. The scientific studies that try and make claims about neurological density between transgender men and transgender women being similar to the sex they claim membership to, those studies are very, very small in sample size. They typically survey like 7 or 8 people who are transgender. They're self-selected, so you don't actually have a good basis for comparison. Really what you'd want to do is sample 1,000 women and then see if all the women who had the most neurological density in certain parts of their brain, were all those women transgender? If the answer is yes, then maybe you have something. If the answer is no, then there's no correlation even. So these studies are really poorly done. They don't hold up under scrutiny. The fact is this: we just don't know that much about how the human brain works. And I would assume that if you are transgender and if you have some sort of mental disorder, that there is a biological basis for the mental disorder. Nobody's claiming that it's you're faking it or that you're choosing to be this thing. But
really important point there, because it seems to me at times he is saying you're faking it, and we can get into that more, but he's acknowledging at least that it's real on some level, or if this evidence is good, that it's real, but then maybe it's a bad thing or a disorder.
That doesn't change the fact that your sex is your sex, and your sex is chromosomally determined. It is biologically determined. Chris Cuomo pretending he doesn't understand that. Maybe he doesn't understand it. Maybe he's just that dumb.
So here again, we almost agree entirely. Yes, sex is sex. The question is, can your brain be structured such that you're going to feel different from that and identify with the other sex, other gender, whatever you want to call it. Nobody's claiming that your physical characteristics change, just that it's reasonable to assume you will feel and act more like the gender that your brain is similar to than determined by your physical body, since of course your thoughts and actions tend to stem from your brain. Despite any jokes to the contrary, usually those thoughts do not come from your genitalia. At least not directly, maybe a little bit by way of hormones. So what I want to get into today based on this is looking a little more at the evidence. So I've pulled up some more of the evidence, and there is a lot of it. And more importantly, it is good research. He says it doesn't hold up under scrutiny. It's my job to scrutinize these things. I get paid to look at research that exists to see if it's strong enough. I also design research from the ground up and conduct the analyses myself. That's my primary area of work right now. So I should know what I'm talking about here. And if you disagree again on the facts, give a correction to what I'm saying, not just a random denial. That doesn't help anyone. One thing I can comment on in general is he talks about sample size. Sample size is important, but it generally affects statistical power and is not particularly important, although some exceptions, for believing the results of a study. The determining factor for that is statistical significance, which includes consideration of sample size. It is hard to reach statistical significance with a small sample. That is true. But in these studies where they do reach it in a small sample, if anything, it points to the fact that that effect is easy to demonstrate and can be demonstrated in a small sample. It doesn't undermine the confidence with which they state their findings, other than slight ways that we think stem from publication bias, and there's something we call the file drawer problem. But in the most essential way, sample size is not a good reason to say the results of a study are no good. And beyond that, we can see there are multiple studies, including reviews of those multiple studies by experts, and they continue to conclude the exact same thing. There are real biological differences in the brain for transgendered people. The evidence tends to suggest, in fact, that either people have a brain more similar to the gender that they identify with, or that transgendered people are in fact a separate category, which may anger people because it would say there should be a third gender in the psychological realm only. We're not saying that this is anything about their sex. No, we're just saying that their brain does not function exactly like a male's or like a female's, or does not have the structure of male or female, but something in between. And the evidence here is fairly overwhelming that it is either something in between or different from those who are cisgendered, or that they align more with their identified gender, and that's worth looking at. Okay, let's look at one study that is a review. Reviews are particularly important because one small sample study does, of course, have less strength than larger scale studies, though it's fair to point out it's hard to find huge samples of transgendered or transsexual people, and those particularly that rely on dissecting the brain also have to wait for people to die and be donors and all these things. But when you combine lots of research, no matter how small the samples, into a body of research that's larger, that gains strength. How much is arguable, but when you have a lot of evidence out there and an expert in the field reviews that, as is true in this review, their conclusions have quite a bit of strength. This is a 2016 study, and as you can see, it says it's a review of the status of brain structure research in transsexualism. So I may make a video where I really go in depth on these and even talk about the statistics. If that sounds good to you, please comment below, or also if that sounds totally boring, let me know. I enjoy that stuff. I know from being a statistics teacher that most people won't find it that interesting, but I'm willing to do it if it sounds interesting to any viewers, so let me know. I'm going to summarize then just briefly what's going on here. They basically talk about looking at things overall, and they say, from the evidence, they would propose that, see this right here, the specific brain phenotypes proposed for male to female and female to male differ from those of both heterosexual males and females. So if we're looking at normal, so to speak, male, normal, so to speak, female, and I don't mean that to be insulting, just it's the majority, it's what we've always accepted exists in these sorts of things. We find that the male to female and female to male people do not match with either. A PDF is free download here. I will link to the page and then you can download if you'd like. Here is just one section of the evidence they're showing. In male to female, we have comparisons of 6 different differences in the brain, and across all of these we find that there's lower levels of something in the female, higher levels in the male, and that the male to female scores are in between somewhere, indicating that they are a different phenotype, neither male nor female. And the little bars and asterisks tell you, if there's an asterisk with a bar, that those two significantly differ from each other. So if you look at the one IFOF, you would see that both male to female and male differ significantly from female, but that there is no significant difference between male to female and male. And in the others where they all appear to be different from each other, that's just what it means. In the Singulum example, we can say that statistically speaking, female is different from both male to female and male, and so on. All of those comparisons between them are significantly different, saying that we have enough evidence to conclude with a high level of certainty, never 100%, but a very high level of certainty, that these are in fact different, and it would be unfair to group them together. Here we have female to male, for some reason 4 different regions, but the same basic pattern here. We find that for things like the corticospinal tract, those are all different, all those comparisons between the bars. And for things like forceps minor, we see that female to male and male both differ from female, but are similar to each other. So this would be one where it supports either a third category, or that the identified gender is where the brain matches more with that sex. So these people are biologically female who identify as male, and this part of their brain is more male than female, although you can see still in between to some extent. So this is the sort of evidence we've got here, and they reviewed several studies. You can see that there's a lot in here. I don't like the argument that, wow, there's a lot in here, so it must be good. But if you actually read it as I have, it's pretty convincing. They have a lot of studies in here. They go into them in depth, and they combine not only brain areas, but post-mortem studies on structure of the brain, as well as in vivo studies on people that are alive on the actual functioning of the brain through functional imaging, where they look at the activity in the brain. And those also tended to agree with the same hypothesis. So we've got, while they're living, the activity; when they're dead, the structure. Some of the structure, I think, can be assessed while alive as well. But they have all that in here. Here's an example of some of the functional imaging. Again, if you want a video where I dissect each of these for 20 minutes and tell you exactly what we did and didn't find statistically and how confident we are in those results, applying them out to the real world, I'd be happy to do so. Let me know in the comments. I'm just really not sure if anyone wants to hear that. One more study on this issue. It is almost certainly one included in the review. 2011 study looks at white matter and male to female transsexuals before hormone treatment. I like these best because the hormone treatment is a pretty clear factor that we expect to change structures as well as functioning over time. So here we are pre-hormonal treatment and looking at physical structures. Here they say the sample size was 18 male to female, 19 male, 19 female. So that's a pretty good sample size for this type of study. Often you do see, as Ben claimed, that they're with 5 to 7. This one's pretty good. Not perfect, but again, imagine trying to do this research. It's more about looking at, do the studies agree over time as they can collect this sort of data. They find that white matter microstructure pattern in untreated male to female transsexuals falls halfway between the pattern of male and female controls. The nature of these differences suggests that some fasciculi do not complete the masculinization process in male to female transsexuals during brain development. So here is both an explanation of, admittedly, a guess with some support at how this happens, as well as confirmation that it exists. And I think it's a really important point to notice how many of these state that the brain structure will be between male and female. So when someone says, I'm gender fluid, or I'm unsure, or may change their mind over time, that makes a lot of sense rather than not making sense. It would be really hard to imagine that a brain inside of a female body would be unaffected by the female hormones we know are in there. So having a purely male brain would be difficult to find. And some of these things happen developmentally. There's differences, sex differences at birth as well as that develop later. And so we can imagine that some of these may exist at birth, meaning that, born this way sort of thing, that because of the way they've differentiated already, they will either experience gender dysphoria or be somewhere in between and may or may not experience that depending on experience and hormones and things like that. And as they then develop as a baby, a child, and an adult, that could be where some of the differentiation happens as well. And again, that's why it's important to look at both those with and without hormone treatment. This one's without. But these findings are hard to ignore. I don't buy this line that these studies aren't good enough. There are lots of them, lots and lots. It's easy to find them. I get overwhelmed when I search rather than trying to find some decent ones. Their methodology seems pretty sound. And when you have sample sizes like this study alone is fairly convincing. And there are many like it confirming the same things: structure, functioning. And it all tends to agree that male to female or female to male fall between the two sexes in their brain development, or at least their current brain state, or that they agree more with the one they identify with, which just makes perfect sense. If you were a little down the spectrum, maybe you had a brain that wasn't entirely male when we look at it, although you have a male body, doesn't mean you would feel like you're female. I think we all experience sometimes where we might identify more with the opposite sex. But this does show that it's something real and biological. So I think that's where the state of this argument is with Ben, is that this is real. And then what does it mean if it's real is the second part. Okay, final comments on this, and just a visual aid. It's not particularly important. Ben and I seem to agree that it's really important that things like bullying aren't allowed, and he's clear about that. He said he was bullied himself a lot. So I believe him in his desire to make sure people are treated well. He also gives an example in one of his other videos of a family member with schizophrenia as something. He says, he has a lot of sympathy for because of seeing a family member experience it. And I think we all agree there. And that's where an important parallel comes into things here. If we are into a respectful conversation about what can we do, and we're concerned equally about the suicide rate of transgendered people and the dignity of people in general, we have to talk about an important point of what does it mean to evidence that transgender is real versus imagined. And so here is just a general visual depiction that is part of the narrative everyone accepts, which is that we can evidence schizophrenia in the brain through imaging, and we can see that it's functionally different. And in fact, disordered. We can see in that case that it doesn't function well and it sort of deteriorates over time. And so it's undeniably real. We don't look at anyone with schizophrenia and say, you're making up your schizophrenia if we can see this. In fact, we recognize their struggle and say, that must be difficult. And we do also label it as a disorder, which is important. There are other things that don't have this legitimate basis. In a Q&A, Ben used the comeback on someone which was good, and I liked it, where they said they were in favor of identifying as the gender they felt versus their biological sex. And he said, well, then why don't you identify as 60? And this girl was, I think, 20 years old, or right about there. He actually asked her, and I think it was 20. And so he had this point, which was very valid, that you can't identify as 60 because there's no biological or chronological evidence for her being 60. It was factually wrong. Then we have a different world of things like schizophrenia, where if you were to say, I identify as schizophrenic, and perhaps I'd like you to treat me differently and avoid some of my triggers, things that might set me off. And for those of you that don't know, yes, of course, a lot of schizophrenics deny they're schizophrenic, but also many, I don't know the numbers, are well aware they're schizophrenic. They usually figure it out over time. And things like hallucinations, they know are hallucinations on some level. Not always, but it's not uncommon at all for someone to acknowledge that they have this disorder. And we can see it in the brain. And so I agree with this distinction of Ben's family member and everyone with schizophrenia deserves sympathy and acknowledgement of what they go through, and that they have a brain that's different from ours. And someone wanting to claim they're 60 when they're 20 and maybe get a senior discount, I totally disagree. Although maybe one day, if we have such good techniques for life extension that somebody can be biologically a different age, maybe younger in most cases than their chronological age, perhaps identifying by the actual breakdown of your body or advancement of it in aging might make sense. But for now, yes, she can't claim she's 60 and expect you or I or Ben to acknowledge her 60ness. That would be stupid. However, in a schizophrenic, we say, yeah, this is real. Why? Because we can see that biochemically you are different, and that must be difficult. What I'm arguing is that there's this small distinction where Ben and I disagree, that if we can establish this, and I believe we already have tremendous evidence for it, that transgenderism is just as biological, then we need to acknowledge that. And of course you have the personal choice. I don't want anyone forced to use pronouns for someone else. I dislike this idea immensely of legislating that, or even having a huge social consequence, especially if you just mess up. I will call on anyone by the gender they choose because I'm nice. And at some point, maybe that's ridiculous. If somebody said to me, identify as a dragon, I might give them that. But I would also admit they're not a dragon. There's no biological evidence. We can crack open their head and they have a human brain, and they're not a dragon. So, things like choosing an age or choosing that you're a dragon are a bit ridiculous, and I don't acknowledge those as reasonable. However, schizophrenia and transgenderism both are evidenced by biology at this point and seem to be real. And if you're thinking, aha, this proves transgenderism is a disorder, I suppose I'm okay with that. No one's saying that it's a good or a bad thing. Perhaps it could even be caused by genetic defects or by contaminants in the environment, as some of my commenters have suggested. I tend not to think it's a disorder, but it's really irrelevant. Disorder is a label to a difference in humans. The question is it real? Schizophrenia is real, and we all tend to believe it's disordered because it's dangerous, scary, and people are detached from reality. And we notice that, and it's a problem. And so, you know, I think if you like country music, you're disordered. And I would totally accept that you really do believe that you like country music, and that maybe your brain is responsible for that, and that it's real. And of course, I'm joking. If you like country music, I just generally don't. There's some that's okay. Just a joking example, because it's really just a label. The question is it real or is it not? And if it's real, we should acknowledge it. Claiming you're 60 or a dragon when you're a 20-year-old human, no. Saying I am transgendered and this is something that is true about me, about which I have little or no control, and it would make my life better if you gave me the consideration based on that. Now that's reasonable, and for schizophrenics as well. Then there's another level where I think Ben pulls some of this from incorrectly, but again, please argue with me below. I actually love the arguments as long as they're more than an insult. And so he says, you know, if I were to support someone's transgender identity, it would be like agreeing with or promoting the hallucinations of a schizophrenic person. This is where I disagree. We're talking about what exists and what their identity is. First of all, we have brain differences from a combination of genetics and environment that are real in both cases as far as we can tell, and we'll continue arguing about the reality of it for transgenderism or transsexualism. All those tend to meld together in the research. Then beyond that, some of the behaviors and ideas are dangerous. So Ben says, well, wanting me to acknowledge that you are female when you have male genitalia is like me saying a hallucination is true, at least if I understand him correctly. I totally disagree there. It is more like, okay, a person with schizophrenia identifies as schizophrenic, and we should treat them as such and give them different treatment that respects who they are. But then if they say, I'm pretty sure that person over there is a demon and I think I'm going to kill them, yeah, don't support that hallucination, because there's no basis in fact for that. Now, similarly, if a transgender person says, one of Ben's points is that someone's who is transgendered, they will magically have all their problems go away if people acknowledge the gender they feel. He has a point there. That's probably not the case. You may still notice that you have a mismatch between biology and the way you feel because of different biology inside your skull. You may also have other things going on in your life that are bad. And a lot of people think surgery is the solution. I support everyone's choice to get that. Just my personal opinion, if somebody says, should I get surgery to change my sex? My default answer is no, unless there's really good evidence or if they're really convinced. Always their choice. I would say I don't think that's what will necessarily make you happy. So these now are on the same level. Is it a good idea to cut up my body? Is it a good idea to go through the hallucination? If both of these lead to negative effects and are not based in any reality, like there's little evidence that getting surgery will make you happier, then of course I won't support that. I'll say there's little evidence that will make you happier. Interesting side note, I might change my mind entirely if the technology gets better. Imagine if genetic and biological sciences advance to where someone could actually get perfect working parts of the sex they wish they were or want to transition to, and it was fully functioning, you know, somehow we had all that technology. That might change my mind a bit, because I think some of the challenge right now is that people are trading parts that work perfectly well for parts that may or may not work perfectly as well in an attempt to gain alignment with their identity. But that's a larger issue. So I think this is really all my disagreement with Ben boils down to. We need to accept the identity, and it would be just as much of being a jerk to deny someone who is transgendered that they want to be referred to and treated as the way they feel, as it would be to deny. So if they say that and we don't do it, it's being a jerk is what I would call it. You know, of course you can do it. You can be a jerk. Same as if somebody said, hey, I'm schizophrenic. Could you please not, make a certain joke or say certain things or take me certain places because it's going to cause me a problem. I'm not going to say that's crazy. It's all in your head. Quit being, although it might be crazy, right? But that would be denying who they are, and that's rude. I just wouldn't do that. And so I think it's an identity issue. Yes, we can say then beyond that, some of the things you may want to do and some of your beliefs you hold might be damaging, and we don't need to support them. But it is not fair to equate identity with some of the more dangerous thinking. And I think that's ultimately the place we disagree. That, and is the biological evidence enough yet to say that I'm putting this in the right category, along with other brain differences. So please comment below, especially the negative comments, positive comments, or something else to check out. Subscribe if you like what I'm saying, and please contribute to the conversation any way you can.